Baby boomers, whether they're first or second wave, also had a lot of commonalities in their experiences too. And as I said, each generation has their own common experiences that frames the way they see things. So they've been called boomers, the Vietnam generation, the me generation, and they're called boomers because it was a post-war boom in births after World War II, where we saw obviously a lot of deaths. And then we had this boost in people being born, so it sort of shifted the population numbers increased quite a bit. And it's called the me generation because they really were trying to fight against the traditional perspectives that were taught by their parents, right? Of, being frugal and being just grateful you had a job. And they're like, no way. I want to do things that are meaningful for me. Um, so events that really influenced them were things like the space race, right? Having John Kennedy say, we're going to go to the moon, and we did. By the end of the 60s, we stepped foot on the moon. It was driven by civil rights legislation and women's liberation. Um, it started, women's libs sort of started in the late 60s, but really, really got its feet underneath it in the 70s. Civil rights, though, started probably in the 50s with Brown versus the Board of Education and desegregating schools, and then culminating with the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and other civil rights legislation that happened under Lyndon Johnson because of, as the next item is there, the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy had a dream, and was he a flawed human being? Of course. But he had some really wonderful ideas about what we could do as a country. And I loved his, phrase, ask not what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It was about giving back and doing what we can to support our country, serving in the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps came out of this time frame, public service, and doing those sorts of things. And the Kennedy assassination, and the whole notion of giving back to your government is things that influenced presidents like Bill Clinton, who grew up in that era. He's a boomer, and he was taught, right? Go out, do service. And that's how he came up with things like AmeriCorps, which paralleled the Peace Corps, right? About not just going out globally and doing things, but we have needs here at home, where people can go out and do work and get credit for it and helps them pay for college, but it gives them, those that want to defer college can be engaged in doing those kind of activities. Boomers, again, as the me generation, were very vocal, and they wanted to be involved in decision making. They wanted to jump in and take on responsibilities. So the funny thing about this is, of course, we hear boomers talking about millennials like, oh, they want to jump in before they're ready. And I have news for them. They did the exact same thing, right? And as you'll see as we go through this, right, every generation has a complaint about the generations that follow them, right? It's not uncommon, and it has been going on since the 1800s, right? Every generation has a complaint about the generations that follow. So, as you can see here illustrated, right? They wanted to be involved in decision making. They believed they were capable of doing things. They saw their voice being used to combat, what they believed to be as an unjust war in Vietnam, and so they wanted to be in the middle of it all. For them, the job wasn't something they were just grateful for. Their job was a measure of their self-worth. So they saw themselves as what they do. I am a doctor, a lawyer, rather than I work in the healthcare field. That's a different perspective, right? They identify who they are by their job title. So those titles mean something for them. They are driven. They will work hard and long hours. That's where the mentality of the 24/7 workplace sort of evolved, that you had to make yourself accessible because you're going to work long hours to do whatever it takes to make money. And this is that lifelong battle, if you've heard about this, between the hippies and the yuppies. The hippies were the ones that were peace, love, and rock and roll, right? The ones with the peace signs and the beads, and they went to Woodstock and they had fun. And then the yuppies were the ones that said, oh, we're not involved in that. We're we want to work hard and we want to do these things and we're going to work long hours and we're going to drive ourselves to be upwardly mobile. And that's what yuppie means. It's young and upwardly mobile individuals. They were going to do whatever it takes to get ahead, and might have meant cheating to do that, but they would do it, right? They were going to go the extra mile. They're very also team oriented. I will say that they are the ones that really embrace this notion of teamwork rather than individualism. And we start to see the shift in participative management and quality circles and things like that in the boomers' time that really pushed us as a country towards a more collaborative and collective approach to doing work. We're still pretty individualistic, but we are much more involved in and more team-based approaches to things. As I implied earlier about the percentages of boomers in the workplace, they are redefining retirement in part because they just don't want to stop working. Like our parents' generation, they stopped working at 55 or 60. Part of it was they were forced to because there was mandatory retirement for many companies. But once those retirement laws were dropped back in the in the 1960s with the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, they wanted to keep working. They wanted to say, I'll work till I drop dead. I don't care. I like to work it because their identity is tied up in this notion of their job and what they do. So the other part of it is because of things that happened in 2008, Bernie Madoff, all the ethical violations, Enron, all those things that happened, they lost a lot of their savings portfolios. And so even if they wanted to retire, they couldn't. So retirement looks different for them. Whereas traditionalists would head to Florida and Arizona to retire, our boomers are doing different things. They're traveling the world. They're doing things differently than their traditionalist parents. Some of the compelling messages that came at boomers when they were growing up was be anything you want to be better than the generation before, to go out and change the world. And think about the Vietnam protests. That was their way of changing the world and making it better. Learning how to work well with others, that whole, collaborative, team-based thing. Boomers were pushed to live up to expectations from their parents, who were very demanding of them. And duck and cover was a big part of the culture for boomers, where they were in school and they had to learn how to duck and cover from, possible nuclear attacks and nuclear bombs. The Cold War was a huge influence on the boomer generation because they just didn't know if tomorrow was going to be the day that the bomb was going to come from the Soviet Union and that was going to end all things. So 100%. These are messages that we can still see manifesting themselves today in the way boomers are. If you look at President Biden, still continuing to want to do work even into his 80s, believing in, doing whatever it can to change the world, to work hard, to continue to do good things. Whether or not you like him, you have to respect his work ethic in that manner. He's worked in Congress for 50 plus years. So he is a boomer in the truest sense of that, right? He's out there doing the work. Technology, right? That big technology for the boomer generation was that lovely TV sitting in the living room, because they went from radio, which you couldn't see, you had to visualize, to suddenly having the images in front of you. And of course, it started out as black and white and evolved into color TV. And now TVs are all sorts of funky stuff in terms of 3D stuff and 4K and high def and all that sort of stuff. So technology, the big driving technology was television at this point in time. Moving on to Gen X, they're also known as the baby busters, which what happened is after the war, a lot of people were born, that's the boomers, and then they didn't have a lot of kids. Their numbers of their children decreased. So they would have one or two kids as opposed to 5 or 6. And so they became the baby busters. They're also called the 13th generation. I don't recall what the source of that was, but that's another nickname you may have heard, but it's not very common. And then post-boomers, right? Generation X is considered like the middle child. Nobody remembers them. Everybody ignores them. They're the latchkey kids, the ones that everybody didn't really think about. And if you look at a lot of news reports and stuff like that, they'll talk about the boomers and then they'll talk about the millennials, and the Gen X is like, hello, we're here. Pay attention to us. So they're like the perennial, middle sibling, in the feeling like they are forgotten by their louder and more boisterous, if you will, siblings on either side of them, the millennials and the boomers. So what are some of the important events that affected us? And I can speak to many of these because these were things that truly influenced me. The global energy crisis. I remember in the 70s, odd and even days going to get gas. And if your license plate had ended in an even number or an odd number, or began with an even number or odd number, depending on the license plate, you would be able to go get gas that day. But you couldn't go get gas if it was not your day. It became really challenging to travel and to go about and to do the things that you needed to do because there was very, very little oil, and what we had was very expensive to get gas. And then a lot of that had to do with a lot of challenges that were going on politically. And so that energy crisis was a massive problem for us after the Vietnam War and leading into the early 80s when Ronald Reagan took over as president. PCs became the big thing. I was in the workplace when people started getting computers put on their desk. Before then, it didn't happen. And so seeing PCs now as a tool that we use, as an expected tool that we use. My house has, I can't tell you how many computers it has in it, but that was considered to be uncommon, back in the early 1980s and the late 70s. So nobody had PCs, at their home. But I will never forget my father coming home. He worked in computers, and he came home very excited, and he had in this little plexiglass little block was a little computer chip, and it was the size of a fingernail. And he said, "You see that thing on that size of that fingernail?" He said, "That my entire computer room fits on that chip." Like, holy cow, that was really cool. So being at the advent of that was pretty exciting to watch those changes, right? Just as you are watching artificial intelligence and seeing changes in cybersecurity and stuff like that, and social media is exciting to you. This was huge for us who did not, we were lucky to have a color TV at that point in our life. And then having the PCs and seeing the way that they changed the nature of work was cool. Stuff like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl were nuclear plant accidents that really framed the way that we thought about workplace safety and nuclear energy, really pushing presidents to engage in nuclear disarmament. Layoffs were big, as we talked about before. When big, companies became big and bureaucratic, layoffs became the next big thing that happened. Then in 1987, the economic recession. I was working at a bank. I happened to be in our trading room at the bank, and I was walking in and talking to somebody, and all of a sudden they started going, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." I'm like, "Well, what's the matter? What's going on?" And like, stock market is tanking, all this sort of stuff. And we were watching in real time, watching, stock prices bottom out. And of course we, in a recession during that time. Pretty scary. I ended up leaving the workforce and going back to school full time, not long thereafter, because the repercussions from, that recession lasted for a good number of years. So in 1990, I was laid off of a job. Thank you, Michael Milken. I was working for Drexel Burnham Lambert. And I ended up, just deciding to go back to school full time because it seemed to make better sense of how I wanted to handle my life. And so that's what I did. What was also pretty cool was the end of communism, or what we thought was the end of communism, although communism is sort of bantered about as an insult, but true communism. The spread of communism had really kind of minimized. The Soviet Union had dissolved. The Eastern Bloc became more independent, doing their own governance, self-governance. Vietnam still considered communist. It is a unified country now, but for a long time, I knew it as North and South Vietnam. Now it's just Vietnam. But it was, the North won. The North was controlled by the Communist Party, and they won that war. And also China is considered communist, as is Cuba. And we try to fight communism, but at the end of the day, it's still strong and it still wins. Although the Soviet Union dissolving was a huge issue. Of course, that doesn't mean that Russia isn't still engaging in the kinds of behaviors that it did when it was controlling the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, it's important to kind of watch those things. Some of the biggest things for Gen X was recognizing, right, that leaders are going to fall and leaders are going to fail, and that people are not always as good as you think they are. We saw the fall of our president, Richard Nixon. We saw the fall of religious leaders like Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker, and they lost their influence at that time, but, times shifted under Ronald Reagan and they increased in popularity again to where we are today, where you look at things like Project 2025. Again, whether or not you believe Donald Trump has anything to do with it, we know Project 2025 talks about the importance of being a Christian nationalist nation, whether or not you believe it, that it is what the document says, that we should be Christian nationalism is the way to go, that we are a Christian nation, which we are not, but that's the argument that's being made in it. Their influence really increased in the Reagan era and then beyond, to the point where we are now. Religious conservatism has taken over the Republican Party in that sense. Gen X was children of divorce. As divorce became destigmatized and allowed in many more states, people weren't staying married. Part of it has to do with people not wanting to stay married because they're unhappy, but also as women became more able to get their own jobs and to survive and thrive on their own without being dependent on a spouse, it gave people the freedom to leave their marriages. The presumption that our grandparents and our grandparents stayed together from some sort of, loyalty, in part that may have been true, but not in all circumstances. I know plenty of people who stayed in unhappy marriages because they couldn't exit. They couldn't leave on their own. They couldn't survive on their own. They could not support themselves financially on their own. So there's not one narrative about why people, why marriage is dissolved and and divorce started to increase at this point in time. But the point is that these kids then had to be latchkey kids, and my mom had to be at work at 6:00 in the morning. My dad had to be at work and leave for work around 7. So I was responsible for making sure both my siblings got on the bus, and that we were able to take off and do what we needed to do. And I was a young kid. It's not the same as parentification, which, you may have heard of that term of parentification, where the child has to be the parent. No, I was being responsible as an older sibling, but I was not being their parent. And I really had to push back at my parents when they tried to do that to me personally, when they were like, well, you're responsible for making sure your siblings do this. I said, I'm not their parent. I can't make them do that. And they're like, yeah, you're right. That's not your job. And I said, no, it's not. I'm happy to make sure they get on the school bus and, get their lunches and whatever, but, I can't make them do it. So latchkey kids, had to make sure that their doors were locked, that they came home, that they didn't play in the neighborhoods anymore, that they had to stay safe at home. Child abductions was starting to become a very popular thing in the media. The milk cartons that had pictures of missing kids on it. And so these kids, while they were being left alone, were being told that they needed to stay, in their house. They had to have their key and lock the door and not let anybody in until their parents came home from work. But the Gen X, what came out of that is Gen X learned how to succeed in an uncertain environment, to become very resilient in how they approach things. And so that's kind of an interesting approach to things. So because of that resilience that Gen Xers had, they became more self-reliant, that they liked to provide measurable results for people, because it's measurable results. It's the actions that matter, not your intentions, But for Gen X, actions are what matter more than anything else. Getting things done, having measurable results. The ambiguity or the chaos, they can survive in that because they can stay focused and they can get the stuff done. They're good about streamlining things. They don't like excess, waste time, wasted effort, etc. They were good at streamlining things and improving processes. They like flexible, results-driven organizations, which is why Gen X is at the head of many corporations now and many businesses. They are the thriving entrepreneurs, if you will, in their 50s. And they're the ones that are encouraging and pushing, right, this flexible, results-driven work from home kind of stuff because they recognize that what matters is the outcome, not the process. What matters is what you deliver at the end of the day. Now, does it matter? Does process matter? Of course it does. But understand, this is the swing, the pendulum swing, right? Gen X was like, oh no, only results matter. And now we recognize that that results do matter, but so do other aspects. Intentions matter too. You need to have both. The important messages for our Gen Xers was don't count on people and don't count on things because we recognize that people are heroes, drop the ball, that heroes really don't exist. It's nice to put them on pedestals, but we recognize we're jaded, we're cynical, right? Heroes really don't exist because we thought these people were cool, and in the end, they were caught up in ethical crises and things like that. And we had to be more realistic, if you will, in the way that we saw people. So get real. It's like, that's the cynicism that's embedded in that. They understood that they needed to take care of themselves. And recall what I said earlier, right? The only person that you can depend on to invest in you is you when it comes to your own development. So that you can see where I get that mentality from, that I believe really strongly that you need to invest in yourself. I'm glad to see organizations are more likely to invest in their employees, but I love the idea of making sure that you are self-reliant, that you can take care of yourself. You can do those things quite readily. And Gen Xers never took things for granted. Like, they didn't just say, okay, because you said so, because that didn't work for us as a generation. We're going to ask why. Why did that happen? Why does that have to happen? And that why question helps to cultivate critical thinking. So when you ask why, we answer why, and we keep pushing back till we have the answers that we want. Blind obedience doesn't get you critical thinking. Blind obedience gets memorization and compliance, but it doesn't get critical thinking. So it is important that we think about critical thinking in that manner. Again, the biggest technology for the Gen Xers was that personal computer, and knowing that personal computers were the thing that we could hold in our hand, in our phones, a computer more powerful than the type of computer that sent people into orbit with the space shuttle, right? So wild when we think about that.